Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take a whole stack of sources, articles, research our own notes, and really pull out the key insights for you. Today, we're diving deep into an author who really takes a multifaceted look at the world. We're focusing on Sean Armstrong. He's a self-defense author, but his writing goes way beyond that into history, politics, philosophy. He's got degrees in criminal justice and homeland security, and you can see a real admiration for C.S. Lewis in his work. That background gives him, I think, a really unique way of looking at human behavior, especially when times get tough, how societies are structured.
That's right. And our mission here is really to unpack some key insights from his work, specifically his book, The Intellectual Journey. It's quite a title. Unraveling the Complexities of Marxist, Communist, and Socialist Thought in Modern Society. Basically, we want to give you a shortcut to getting informed on these really big, often debated ideas.
Yeah, exactly. And our sources for this, they're pretty rich. We've got excerpts from the About the Author section, key chapters from the Intellectual Journey, plus some extra docs that give more context on the history and concepts he tackles. Think of it as your guide to understanding these foundational ideas.
We're going to look at where these ideas actually came from, how they were put into action sometimes with pretty devastating results, actually, and how they still shape things today. The goal is really to get us thinking critically about economic systems, freedom, society's well-being, all that.
Okay, so let's unpack this then. To really get where Karl Marx was coming from, we need to go back. Back to the Industrial Revolution, that was a time of huge inequality, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. A real crucible.
You had this massive shift, right? People moving from farms to cities, factories popping up everywhere, and the rise of these factory owners, capitalists, industrialists, whatever you want to call them.
Yeah, and it wasn't just that there was inequality, it was how stark it was. The specifics are pretty shocking. Like, you might have a factory worker in England back then earning maybe 10 shillings a week.
Oh.
Barely enough to live on.
Wow.
While the owner's making thousands of pounds a year, and the conditions just grueling.
Like 12, 16-hour days.
Exactly. Terrible ventilation, hardly any safety, and kids working too, sometimes as young as 6.
6 years old.
Yeah. And living conditions weren't much better. Think overcrowded slums, unsanitary. Manchester was famous for it. It created this huge divide, the bourgeoisie, the owners, and the proletariat, the workers, and getting ahead. Very, very difficult.
You see that reflected in literature too, right? Like Charles Dickens painting these really vivid pictures of suffering.
Definitely.
And it's no wonder people started pushing back. That's when you see labor movements starting, trade unions forming late in the 19th century, people organizing, demanding change, which led to some early laws like the Factory Acts in Britain, trying to regulate hours and safety a bit.
Right. But it makes you think, looking back at that, how different is it today, really?
That's the question, isn't it?
Well, yeah. I mean, think about wealth accumulation now. When wealth gets really concentrated, it doesn't just create a gap. It can actually block social mobility. Kids from privileged backgrounds get better education, healthcare. It sets them up differently.
And influences politics, too.
Hugely. The sources mentioned this stat in 2019. Just the top 100 donors gave almost $1.5 billion to federal elections in the U.S.
$1.5 billion?
Yeah. So it's not just about who has the money. It's about who has the influence, who shapes the rules. It really forces you to ask, how does that history echo in today's debates about economic inequality?
It really does. Some of these fundamental questions just don't seem to go away. So this backdrop of inequality, this is what leads us to Karl Marx and his big ideas.
Right. Marx looked at all this and basically said, the core issue is class struggle, this conflict between the owners, the bourgeoisie, and the workers, the proletariat. He saw that as the engine driving history forward, creating change.
Okay, class struggle. What else?
Then there's historical materialism. The idea that it's the material conditions, the economic base of society that shapes everything else, politics, culture, ideas, not the other way around.
So the economy shapes the ideas.
In his view, yeah. And maybe one of his most relatable concepts today is alienation. He argued that under capitalism, workers become estranged from their own labor, from the things they produce, even from their own, human potential. They feel like just a cog in a machine.
Yeah, disconnected. And you see stats today like that Oxfam report from 2022, the wealthiest 1% having more than twice the wealth of almost 7 billion people combined.
Exactly. It makes you pause.
So while people debate Marx's solutions, that core issue he flagged, economic inequality, it certainly seems to persist, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And it's really interesting. The sources mentioned this kind of surprising connection. Some bourgeois intellectuals, people from the very class Marx was critiquing, actually found his ideas compelling.
Really?
Well, they shared some of the same concerns about exploitation, about capitalism's tendency towards crisis like the Great Depression or the 2008 crash. And they connected with the ideas of alienation, the cultural critique, too. It's a bit of a paradox, isn't it?
Yeah, that the people benefiting from the system could also be critical of it.
Right. Though, it's also noted there was often a disconnect, maybe skepticism, from the actual working class towards these intellectuals embracing Marxism.
Interesting. So, okay, we have the theory, the critique. How did this actually play out? Let's shift to Russia. That's where these ideas really got put into practice, right?
It is. And World War I was a huge catalyst there.
How so?
Well, the war just devastated Russia. Massive casualties, food shortages, inflation sky high. It created huge social unrest. And it completely weakened the Tsarist regime. Led to the February Revolution in 1917, Tsar Nicholas II had to abdicate.
So the country's basically falling apart, ripe for something radical.
Exactly. And into that chaos steps Vladimir Lenin.
Right. Lenin, his return was quite dramatic, wasn't it?
It was. He came back in April 1917, and fun fact, the Germans actually helped him get back.
The Germans, why?
They wanted to destabilize Russia even more, knock them out of the war. So they let Lenin travel through Germany in a sealed train.
Wow, strategic move.
Very. And once back, Lenin was incredibly effective. He laid out his plan in the April Theses, used slogans like peace, land, and bread. That really resonated with soldiers sick of the war, peasants wanting land, workers facing hardship.
And he adapted Marx's ideas too, didn't he?
He did, significantly. He pushed the idea of a vanguard party, a dedicated group of revolutionaries to lead the way, because he didn't think the workers could do it spontaneously. And crucially, he brought the peasantry into the fold as key allies, which was a big shift from classical Marxism that focused almost entirely on industrial workers.
Very pragmatic. And all this build towards the October Revolution later that year, 1917. The Bolsheviks seized power.
That's right, led by Lenin. And one of their first big moves was to get Russia out of the war, signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany.
So, big picture. What did this Russian experiment mean for Marx's legacy?
Well, it fundamentally changed it. It took Marxism from theory on paper to, actual government practice. They started implementing state control, policies like war communism, basically, centralized control of the economy. Lenin's approach became a kind of blueprint for other revolutions later on, and they formed the Comintern to try and spread communism globally. It was the first real test case.
But that test case had a very dark side, too, which brings us to someone like Alexander Solzhenitsyn. His writings give a powerful, critical look at the Soviet reality.
Absolutely. His own experience was harrowing. Arrested in 1945 just for criticizing Stalin in a private letter to a friend.
Just for a letter.
It shows the level of paranoia and control. And his books, The Gulag Archipelago, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, they expose the Gulag system in brutal detail.
What was that system like, based on his descriptions?
It was bureaucratic terror, mass arrests, often on flimsy or arbitrary grounds, show trials. The NKVD, the secret police were everywhere. Then the physical suffering in the camps. Forced labor, often pointless, just grinding people down. Starvation rations, extreme cold.
And the psychological aspect.
Just as devastating, maybe more so. Constant surveillance, prisoners encouraged to inform on each other, destroying trust, and this systematic dehumanization, taking away names, reducing people in numbers. It was designed to break the human spirit.
And Solzhenitsyn's big point was that this wasn't just some mistake, right? Not an accident.
Exactly. He argued the Gulag wasn't an aberration of Soviet communism. It was integral to it. A necessary tool to enforce conformity, crush dissent. He saw it as reflecting a deep moral crisis where the ideology was used to justify any level of brutality. And his powerful message was that staying silent when you see such injustice makes you complicit.
A very heavy but incredibly important insight. Okay, so we've seen the theory, the revolution, the grim reality, but there were also strong counter-arguments brewing, especially on the economic front. Let's pivot to that. The Austrian School of Economics and Ludwig von Mises.
Right, Mises. His big critique is known as the economic calculation problem. It's pretty fundamental.
Okay, what's the problem?
He basically argued that without private property, and crucially without market prices, a socialist planned economy simply cannot work rationally. Think about it. Prices in a market reflect supply, demand, what people actually value. They act as signals.
Right. Telling producers what to make, how much.
Exactly. Without those price signals, how does a central planner know what's needed where? How do they allocate resources efficiently? Mises said it leads inevitably to chaos, misallocation, shortages, surpluses, Inefficiency.
And his argument was that capitalism, for all its flaws, does have those signals.
Yes. He argued it aligns self-interest with creating value for society through profit and loss incentives. It encourages innovation, efficiency. Socialist systems, he believed, tend to stifle that creativity and lead to stagnation because they lack those mechanisms.
Did we see evidence of this calculation problem in practice?
Well, proponents would point to the Soviet Union's persistent economic struggles, especially in the early decades. The constant problems with matching production to needs seemed to bear out Mises' concerns.
Then came Friedrich Hayek, who built on Mises' ideas.
Yes, Hayek took it a step further. He focused on the limits of knowledge. His point was that the information needed to run an economy is vast, complex, and dispersed among millions of individuals. No central planning board, no matter how smart, could possibly gather and process all that knowledge effectively.
Okay, so it's not just about calculation, it's about information itself being decentralized.
Precisely. And Hayek famously warned, in The Road to Serfdom, that trying to control the economy centrally doesn't just lead to inefficiency, it inevitably leads to restrictions on political freedom, too. Authoritarianism.
That link between economic and political freedom.
He saw them as inseparable. It's a powerful argument, and one that still resonates in debates about government intervention today. Finding that balance is tricky, isn't it?
Absolutely. It feels like a constant tightrope walk.
It really does.
So, thinking about Mises and Hayek, and looking back at Marx's predictions about capitalism collapsing, history took a different turn, didn't it?
It really did. Capitalism proved much more adaptable than Marx anticipated. You saw the rise of welfare states, providing social safety nets. Mixed economies emerged, blending market mechanisms with government regulation. We had periods of significant economic growth, rising living standards, the growth of consumerism.
And things like corporate social responsibility movements, too, companies trying to address some of the criticism.
Exactly. All these developments sort of countered Marx's narrative of inevitable decline and revolution. Capitalism evolved.
Okay, so not every country followed the Soviet model, or even the pure capitalist one. Let's look at some variations. Yugoslavia, for instance. Tito carved out a unique path there.
He certainly did. Josip Broz Tito really wanted Yugoslavia to be independent, not just a Soviet satellite. He developed this distinct brand of socialism.
What did that look like?
A key element was self-management socialism. The idea was to give workers more say in how their enterprises were run, trying to foster a sense of ownership. They also decentralized the economy quite a bit, with regional councils having more power. This was meant to spur development across the country and build regional pride.
Did it work economically?
For a while, yeah.
Uh,
The sources mentioned pretty impressive industrial growth, like around 10% annually between the late 40s and mid-60s.
and Yugoslavia was incredibly diverse ethnically, right? How did Tito manage that?
That was maybe his biggest challenge and achievement. He pushed this idea of brotherhood and unity, granted significant autonomy to the different republics, Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, Slovenes, and others. The 1974 Constitution really cemented this federal structure. It was a complex balancing act.
But that balance didn't hold after he died in 1980.
No, his death left a huge vacuum. The unifying force was gone. Old ethnic tensions, which had been suppressed but never really resolved, started bubbling up again.
And economic problems, too.
Yes, big time. The country had taken on a lot of international debt, and when the economy faltered, those pressures mounted.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster.
And sadly, it was. Nationalism surged, the economy went into crisis, hyperinflation was insane in the early 90s, prices doubling almost daily at its peak.
Wow.
And ultimately, the country disintegrated into brutal conflicts like the Bosnian War. It's a stark reminder of how fragile unity can be, especially when ethnic identities clash and the economy tanks.
A really tragic outcome. Okay, let's shift again, this time to China. After Mao died, Deng Xiaoping took things in a radically different direction.
Radically different is right. Deng was all about pragmatism. His famous saying was, "It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice," meaning ideology is less important than results.
So what was his socialism with Chinese characteristics?
It involved major market-oriented reforms. He decollectivized agriculture, introducing the household responsibility system. Basically, families could farm their own plots and keep or sell the surplus.
And that had a big impact.
Huge. Rural poverty plummeted. We're talking from around 30% down to under 10% between the late 70s and mid-90s.
What else?
He set up special economic zones, SEZs like Shenzhen. These were areas designed to attract foreign investment with tax breaks and fewer regulations. They became engines of industrial growth, creating millions of jobs.
The overall result was massive economic growth.
Unprecedented, really.
Right.
China averaged something like 10% GDP growth per year for 3 decades. Hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty, an incredible economic transformation.
An economic miracle, you could say. But there's that dual legacy again, isn't there? Economic opening didn't mean political opening.
Not at all. Deng's leadership, while delivering prosperity, was also highly authoritarian. They maintained tight control over political dissent and human rights.
Which brings us to Tiananmen Square in 1989.
Exactly. That was a pivotal moment. You had growing calls for political reform, partly fueled by the economic changes, meeting a hardline response from the state.
The protests were violently suppressed.
They were. And that event really cemented the path China was on. Economic liberalization, yes, but under strict one-party rule that prioritized stability and growth above political freedom. That basic formula still shapes China today.
So, stepping back from these specific cases, what are the enduring legacies? What are the ongoing debates that stem from all this history we've covered?
Well, one clear legacy is the evolution of labor rights. We've come a long way from those early industrial conditions. Think about events like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York in 1911, a horrific tragedy, but it spurred real change over 30 new laws on workplace safety just in New York State.
Right, and broader movements led to things like the Fair Labor Standards Act in the U.S. in '38, setting minimum wages, overtime pay.
Exactly. It shows how political action, often driven by the very conditions Marx critiqued, gradually forced improvements in worker safety and rights within capitalist systems.
Another interesting thread is that tension between nationalism and Marxism. You mentioned Germany in the 1920s earlier.
Yeah, that's a key example. In the chaos after World War I, with terrible economic hardship, Marxist groups were active, pushing for class solidarity. But ultimately, nationalist movements proved much more powerful in mobilizing people, appealing to national pride, finding scapegoats. It resonated more strongly than calls for international worker unity. Shows that identity politics can often trump class politics.
And Marxist thought itself hasn't stood still, has it? It's branched out.
Definitely. It's evolved way beyond just the classic orthodox interpretations. You have things like post-Marxism.
What's that about?
It sort of expands the focus, still looks at power and inequality, but brings in identity, race, gender, sexuality alongside class, sees struggles happening on multiple fronts.
Okay. And then there's social democracy.
Right, which is probably the most common adaptation in the West. It's not about overthrowing capitalism, but reforming it. Using the state to provide universal health care, education, strong safety nets, minimum wages, trying to moderate capitalism's harsher edges.
And cultural Marxism, that term gets thrown around a lot.
It does, often inaccurately. But originally it relates to the Frankfurt School thinkers. They shifted focus from just the economic base to the cultural superstructure. How do dominant ideas, values, and norms shaped by media, education, culture maintain the status quo? They talked about cultural hegemony.
How the ruling class shapes how everyone thinks.
Kind of, yeah. And later thinkers like Foucault built on critiques of power, looking at how morality and knowledge systems themselves can be forms of control. These ideas influence a lot of critical theory today.
So clearly the echoes of Marx, Lenin, Mises, Hayek, all these figures and events, they're still very much with us. These historical lessons seem crucial for understanding today's debates about wealth inequality, about government's role versus individual freedom, about social justice.
Absolutely. These aren't just history lessons. They're tools for thinking about the present and the future. How do we structure our economies? How do we balance competing values? And that really brings up a final thought, maybe a question for you listening. In a world still facing huge economic gaps, awash in information and misinformation, constantly navigating this tension between personal liberty and the collective good, what's your responsibility? How do you critically engage with the ideas, past and present, that are shaping our world?
That's a great question to leave things on. We really hope exploring these histories helps you reflect on our current challenges and choices. Understanding these deep dives, we think, is key to navigating the complexities of the world around us.